Jace here, and welcome to Legacy Academy on Lady Glenn's YouTube channel. And today we're going to be talking about photography and videography. I am a photographer sometimes I'm a videographer, and I do a lot of video editing also. And today we're just going to be talking about the basics to photography, basics to videography. You know, maybe you have your professional camera, maybe you only have your mobile device, but you still want to know how to take good pictures, you still want to know how to take good videos. So I hope that we will spend the next maybe 10 minutes, and after which you will have a better understanding of photography and videography. So there are some main topics that must be discussed when we're talking about photography and videography. And the first one being shutter speed. I'm sure that you have heard of that term before, maybe not. But when you think about a camera, you think about a shutter, especially those long time cameras, you know, when you click on it, you hear click, click. I hope I'm making that sound right. But yeah, so the shutter just talks about how long light is allowed to actually come into that camera before it closes. And the shutter speed can start from maybe, like, on some cameras it's like a fraction, so it can be 1/8,000, and it can go up to maybe 1/30, and of course 1/8,000, you know, that's like for low light. And then as we go further up, of course the camera obviously allows more light to pass through, but usually it is either a fraction, or for some film cameras you may have it as like degrees, so like 360 degrees, 180 degrees, but most times on regular DSLR cameras you're gonna see it as a fraction. So the first component is shutter, and as you can tell, shutter has somewhat to do with the amount of light that passes through the camera. And then the next one we're going to be talking about is the aperture, and the aperture just basically talks about your depth of field. You know, someone may be wondering, Jace, are you going crazy? What do you mean by depth of field? And the depth of field just means how sharp does a subject appear when compared to the other parts of that image, which is not sharp. So let me give you an example before you go crazy. So right now I am, as you can see right now, my background is not as in focus as my face right now. So that speaks about your depth of field, how shallow your background is. Maybe like you have some background, let's just say you're playing sports. Obviously you don't need one person to be in focus, but you need everybody to be in focus. So obviously your aperture would be at a higher point. So let me give you an example. For a lot of cameras the aperture starts at like 1.4. 1.4 means that you have something specific that's in focus, but as you go up in that number, more things actually show in focus. So let's just say you're comparing f1.8 versus f11 or f22. F22 would mean that everything right here is in focus. It means that my background, my lights, my camera that's right there, that would also be in focus. So right now we're working with a f2.8, which means that it has a shallow depth of field, but not an extreme shallow depth of field. I hope you're understanding me, class. And that also has to do with the amount of light that passes through the camera. And the final component that we're going to be talking about is your ISO. And your ISO just speaks about how how much additional light do you need to feed into your camera to get your image to look the way how you want it to look? So like for example, right now the camera that I'm shooting on is at ISO 400, but if it was at ISO 100, which this camera does not have because it is actually a professional video camera, but if it was at 100, it would mean that I would look extremely bright right now, like I would look overexposed. So it just talks about how much additional light the camera needs to ensure that whatever image you're showing has enough light. So a low ISO would mean that you have less light being fed into the camera. However, what that also means is that the lower you put your ISO is the more outside light external of the camera that you're going to need to feed in. So like right now I have a continuous softbox light that's shooting light on me right now, but if I didn't have that light, then I would need to have turned up the ISO extremely high in the camera to be able to see me well lit. However, can anybody tell me the catch with that one now? The higher you go with the ISO is the more grain that shows in your image. And grain is not usually a good thing in your image. You usually want your image to look clean. You usually want your image to look sharp. But the more light you have to feed into that camera, or the higher you go with the ISO, is the more grain you're going to see in that image. So the shutter, how long does that component keep open to allow light to pass through? Your aperture, the depth of field, how shallow your image is with your subject in compared to your background. Then we're talking about your ISO, and that deals with additional lighting that we need to actually feed into the camera. Now, once we understand those components, because it's one thing to understand them, but putting them together, yeah, that's where the tricky part comes in. So many persons tend to buy a camera and the first thing they put it on is automatic, and the camera is going to try to figure out where the shutter should be, where the ISO should be, where the aperture should be. It's going to try to do that for you, and it doesn't always do a good job. So that's why we need to kind of understand how each of them work together in order to get that beautiful look. So let me give you an example, and I hope I don't lose you guys. So if we're taking a picture, if you have a shutter that is under maybe 1/125 for a photo, any little shake, or if the person is moving or dancing or playing a sport, they're gonna look blurry. You may see their hand in the picture, like everything is in focus, but their hand is blurry, or a part of their body is blurry, or maybe they're dancing and a part of them. Usually it's because the shutter is too low. The lower you go with the shutter, what needs to happen is that the more still. I hope that makes sense. Is the more still. That still doesn't sound like it makes sense. But just think about it like this: if I'm not moving, then I don't need to have a high shutter. So 1/125 and up if the person is moving. If the person is playing a sport, you may need to go to 1/500, 1/600. So it means that, let's just say like running water, things that are moving fast, if you want to catch it in focus, you have to go up with your shutter. And the lower you go now is the more you may get that blurry feel to your image. So once you understand that about shutter, it deals with how blurry your image becomes when you take that picture. When the shutter flies in that camera, how much light was allowed to pass through the camera before the image was taken. Now talk about your aperture. If there's one person here talking to you right now, I'm in focus, I can stay in focus. Once the camera locks focus on me, I'm good to go. So I can have a low aperture. Because remember, the lower the aperture, what it means is that it's gonna focus on that one area. So like for example, a lower aperture may focus on a smaller area, and as the aperture goes up, it gets wider. Now if I was in a scenario where I was talking to somebody right now, I could not have used this low aperture. Why? Is because if I'm in focus, then what about the other person? They also need to be in focus, which means that I would need to go up with my aperture to allow more to be in focus, or more, or the sharpness to be better in that image. So your aperture changes as you go up. More things are in focus. As you go down, what happens is that it locks into an exact image. Now, a lot of cameras, they, especially like the cheaper lens, those lenses won't go down under 3.5. But then you have some lens that will go down to 1.4, which means that you have to get that point in focus, or else it's going to be easy for that image to look blurry. So the beautiful thing about a low aperture is that you can get something in focus and everything else in the background is blurry. But if you miss that focus, you're going to miss that image, and it's going to be evident that it was out of focus. I hope you guys are understanding me so far. For the ISO I believe is straightforward. The higher up you go, the more light your camera will kind of help with that image, but it gets grainier. It has more grain. That's the right term. So like right now, because I didn't want my image to have a lot of grain, I have an external light right here, and that external light is kind of just allowing the camera to show the nice image without a lot of grain, so the camera doesn't have to overcompensate with lighting by way of the ISO. So class, these are the fundamental components of photography and videography. We need to ensure that we understand these components, and we'll be fine. In the case of a photographer, you can get an external flash. So right now, for a videographer, I'm doing a video right now. I have a continuous light. It means that light is, all I do, I plug it in, I turn it on, and there's light that's coming on me right now. But if you're a photographer, let's just say you're taking pictures in the night, you're gonna need to ensure that you have a light source, whether it's a continuous light like this, which is not always the case, but you may need to get a flash. And simply put, a flash will allow you to, when you take that picture, what happens is that light comes from in here, light spreads, and it allows you to take that image so that you don't have to rely heavily on the lighting that's coming from your camera. And the truth is, these components, though we don't know it, but even the phones that we use, they have automatic aperture, shutter, ISO. It's just that the manufacturers, you know, because it's a cellular phone, you don't want to be going through all of these kind of settings just to get a picture or just to get a nice video. So it's extremely important that we understand these components before we actually get our camera. And that covers the fundamentals of professional photography and videography. These three fundamentals, it applies to video, it applies to pictures, and it applies to well, videos and pictures. The last component I want to talk to you about is stability. Now, why is this important? Because if you have a camera and you're not able to hold that camera steady, it means that more than likely your hand is shaking, so that image will not come out as sharp or in focus as you would like. Why am I talking about this? Because a lot of the pictures that we see out there and they're blurry, it's not necessarily the camera's fault, but sometimes it's our fault. Because we're shaking, maybe we're nervous, all these kind of things. It shows. For photographers and for videographers, we have some cameras that come with stabilization. It means it helps you out a bit. But for cameras, a lot of cameras don't come with this. It means that even a video, let's just say, have you seen somebody ever, like you've seen somebody recording a video and the video is just shaky? yeah, stabilization is extremely important. What I find helps when I'm taking pictures or videos, I usually put my camera on a tripod, and that allows it to remain stable. So I hope that you learned something from today's session, and I hope that you go out there, take up your phone, take your pictures, take your videos. If you want to get better at this, practice is the key. If I'm to encourage you with one thing, is that practice. Go out there, take 1,000 pictures, take 4,000 pictures, see what works, see what doesn't work. Lighting is going to be so crucial when you're taking pictures. When you're taking pictures in the sun versus when you're taking pictures at night, in the evening or in the morning, the lighting will determine how beautiful your image comes out. So thank you for joining us on Lady Glenn's page for Legacy Academy. I am Jace Myrie. Take care.